regarding pipits, but it also applies to a lot of these other species at the same time. So grassland birds, although there's not a lot of species in this community compared to other habitat types such as forests or wetlands, it is quite a diverse group with a wide range of species within it. So grassland birds consist of owls and hawks as one example, such as the burrowing owl and frugivorous hawk. It also consists of a wide variety of shorebirds as well. So these species are associated with wetlands, but a lot of them will use these grassland habitats for nesting or raising their young. So some examples of these shorebirds are upland sandpipers and long-billed curlew. And then you have your grassland songbird group as well. So this is made up of the smaller sized birds. They often have the distinct musical songs that you'll hear when you're out there that they use in their breeding period. And this consists of birds like the Sprague's pipit, western meadowlark, bobolink, as well as a variety of sparrow species as well. And as you can see, just by this diagram here, no single grassland is good for all of these species. Each one has their own unique habitat requirements. So grasslands can range from very tall and dense grass situations to short and sparse grass. And the type of species you see in each condition varies. So in these tall, dense grasslands, you tend to see species such as bobolink or cedron. In these short, sparse grasslands that are created kind of by more high-intensity grazing, you'd see McCown's longspur or burrowing owl or willets. There are also a variety of grassland bird species that rely on some of these tree or shrub habitats adjacent to the grasslands, and these are mostly used for nesting. So this is like the frugivorous hawk and the loggerhead shrike. But if you look at where Sprague's pipits fall into this group, they're kind of in the middle. They like that medium density grass. So this group of grassland songbirds, like many other grassland birds, they're adapted to these wide open prairie conditions. And it's found that nearly all of these species are facing very steep continent-wide declines. And a lot of research has been done into why these declines are happening, and it's been found that it doesn't appear that they're related to any single factor, so they're unrelated to breeding and wintering distribution, as well as migratory strategy, life history, or habitat requirements. They just can't seem to pinpoint one single thing that connects all these birds together, other than the fact that they use grasslands. So just if you take a quick look at the population trends of some of these species, in North America there's 35 species that are considered obligates of grassland habitats. And then it was found that from 1966 to 1977, 35 of these species were in decline. And if you look at the period a little later than that, so in 1980 to 2004, the situation has gotten actually much worse, and 80% of these species are now in decline. Then just a quick comparison about how these birds in grassland habitats compare to kind of other vegetation types. You can see by this graph, on the left-hand side in the light green, that's where you have a percentage of species from that group that are increasing. And on the right-hand side in the dark green, that's the percentage of species that are decreasing. And you can see for grassland habitats, there's a very, very strong majority of the species that are in decline, and very few that actually are showing positive population increases. And when you compare this to some of the other habitat types, such as woodlands or wetlands, you see that there's actually a little bit larger proportion of the popular bird species that are increasing. And then even for some of the other habitats where you see more species declining, you don't see that really massive jump that you see in that grassland. So these grassland birds appear to be a lot worse off than kind of other birds from other habitat types. So now I'm going to jump into just kind of a quick overview of Sprague's pipit, and that'll be kind of the focus of my talk from now on. So the Sprague's pipit is actually a pretty nondescript bird. It doesn't have any distinct coloration or any really noticeable markings that you might see in other birds, such as meadowlarks or chestnut-colored longspurs. It's a brownish-colored bird. It has slight markings kind of around the neck, head, back, and wings. Kind of some of the real distinct features that set this bird apart from other species in these areas are this long, narrow bill that you can see. This is because the bird feeds on insects. It's got kind of a very specialized beak for this. Another distinguishing factor is its tail. It's got these very dark tail feathers, and on the outside it's got a very distinct white to it. So this is usually noticeable when it's in flight. The bird's also fairly small, as you can see from these pictures here. It does fit in a person's hand when they're holding it. So it's slightly larger than some of the birds you would see at bird feeders such as chickadees or finches, but at the same time a little bit smaller than, say, a robin.
Are you going to play the sound, Phil?
In just a second.
Okay.
Okay. So because it's doesn't have any really distinct markings or any characteristics, it can often be confused with some of these grassland sparrow species. So there's a grassland sparrow pictured here on your left-hand side. But as I mentioned, the main feature of the Sprague's pipit that sets it apart is that very long, skinny bill. You can see the sparrow has a much thicker bill, and that's because it specialized more on feeding on seeds rather than insects. And the thing about pipits too is they're a very secretive bird. It's very hard, very rarely that you'll actually get a nice close-up view of it to kind of look at some of these features. Most often you'll actually see them way up in the air, and you'll usually hear them before you actually see them. So they have a very distinct sound that's it's not very similar to any other bird in these grassland habitats. And I have a sound file, but it didn't work today. But Kayla's gonna just play a quick sound just so you get an idea of what they. So it's kind of a series of descending notes there, and it's pretty difficult to mistake that sound with kind of any other bird in the area. In other habitat types, there's some birds that sound kind of similar, but if it's in a grassland and it sounds similar to that, it's most likely a Sprague's pipit. And what it does is, while it's making this sound, it's displaying way up in the air, so it's flying quite high. It almost just looks like a small brown dot up there, and it'll do this display along with the song for approximately 15 minutes. But in some cases, it can be up there flying for up to 3 hours before it actually lands on the ground. So here I've got a map of the distribution of Sprague's pipits. You can see that the breeding distribution that's shown in blue takes up quite a bit of southern Saskatchewan. That's a big portion of its range. The range also kind of expands into parts of Alberta, Manitoba, Montana, a big chunk in North Dakota, and even a little bit of South Dakota. The wintering range of this species is found in the southern United States as well as northern Mexico. And this is pretty standard for a lot of grassland birds. They'll migrate south, but they'll still use those grassland habitats, just in a little warmer climate. So here's just kind of a close-up view of the Sprague's pipit distribution in Canada here. You can see the red areas are areas with higher densities of Sprague's pipits. And then as you kind of grade into the orange, yellows, and green, you start to see less and less. And the areas very distinguished in red is a lot of southern Alberta as well as portions of southwestern Saskatchewan. And the reason you're seeing these larger number of birds in these areas is just the amount of native prairie that still remains in these areas. So Sprague's pipits are very reliant on native prairies, so you're likely only to see them in spots where this occurs, and that's why you're seeing kind of the distribution the way you do. As far as nesting goes, the typical nesting period is from May to August, and what Sprague's pipits will do is they'll create these dome nests within the residual vegetation right on the ground. So some of the key factors in regards to nest selection for these species is residual vegetation. That's that dead vegetation that carries over from the previous year. Vegetation height is also another important thing that's been found, as well as litter depth. And all these are important because they need that cover in order to shield their nests, kind of both from overhead predators as well as predators on the ground. And within that nest, they'll typically lay between 4 to 6 eggs. And the female incubates the eggs for 12 to 15 days, and then once the eggs hatch, the young will remain in that nest for approximately 10 to 13 more days after that. So in Canada, we have approximately 80% of the breeding population of Sprague's pipits. It's also been found through surveys such as the Breeding Bird Survey that the species experience long-term declines, and there's been no real evidence that the population is rebounding. It's kind of appears slightly stable at the moment, but for the most part, it's in major decline. Sprague pipits also considered to be habitat specialists, so it requires, again, these large tracts of intact native prairie in order for it to persist. And because of these reasons, it was decided in 2000 that the species should be added to the species at risk list, and it was designated as threat at this time. So let's go over in more detail some of the reasons why it was given this listing. So the first reason is these declining population trends. So again, looking back at breeding bird survey data, and the breeding bird survey is an annual survey that takes place across North America. They sample the same routes, it's along roadsides, and this just gives you a general idea of how bird populations are faring. Are they increasing, decreasing, or remaining stable? So looking back at this data from 1968 to 2008, which is a 40-year period, the data shows a 4.4% annual decrease in Sprague's pipit populations. And this equates to a loss of approximately 83% of the entire population during this time. However, a closer look at the data, so from 1997 to 2007, the analysis shows a small, non-significant increase. So this is not so much that the population is rebounding, it's more of a sign that the population is just kind of remaining stable at this point. So this is depicted in the graph that I have shown here. It's a measure of abundance index that's used by the breeding bird survey. And you can see that Sprague's pipit abundance is declining quite sharply from the mid-60s, and then it reaches about the mid-1990s, and then it starts to remain relatively stable from that point on. But still, very low, and if it weren't for this kind of very stable portion during this time, it's very likely that if it continued on this downward trend, the species could have gone extinct. So here's a map that just kind of shows where a lot of these major declines are occurring. So you can see a lot of red, which represents areas where the populations are declining. And these are occurring in mostly Alberta. So again, if you think back of where Sprague's pipits are most abundant, that happens to also be in Alberta. So it's kind of having even a more effect in this situation here. You're also seeing declines kind of in the northern part of the range, as well as parts of Montana and North Dakota. And then the blue areas are actually locations kind of where Sprague's pipit populations are either remaining stable or showing slight increases as well. So these are situated mostly near the center part of the range. Another reason for the listing the Sprague's pipit as threatened is just general habitat loss. So there are quite a few things that have been found to destroy critical habitat for Sprague's pipit, but all these activities can kind of be divided into a few major categories. The first is any activities that cause loss of native vegetation or disturbance to the soil. So this can be things such as cultivation. Also activities that result in the degradation of native prairie into a poor range condition. So this is based on just kind of a general range health index that's used for used by a lot of range ecologists as far as livestock production goes. Any activities that cause increased bare ground, establishment of woody vegetation, or establishment of exotic plant species. So these can be plants that are intentionally seeded in terms of livestock production, such as crested wheatgrass or alfalfa, but they can also be exotic invasive species, such as leafy spurge. And all these have a negative impact on the Sprague's pipit. As well as activities that result in the construction of man-made structures. So oil wells, power lines, roads, and even homesteads are generally avoided by the Sprague's pipit. They like that wide open expanse. So one of the main factors that are resulting in this habitat loss has been cultivation. And the reason for this is cultivation has occurred on such a widespread scale across the prairies. And also, once this native prairie is lost, it's very difficult to return back to a natural state. Some would argue it might even be impossible to get that natural community with all the insects and some of these lichen species as well. It doesn't just have to do with reseeding native species of grass. So although the rate of native prairie cultivation has slowed over the years, it still is occurring kind of on an annual basis. So even though these chunks of native prairie are smaller and it's happening less and less frequently, we have so little native prairie that kind of every little bit matters at this point in regards to the species. And a lot of this loss of native prairie is occurring on private lands that are unprotected, and it's just resulting in not only considerably more loss of native prairie, but also kind of fragmentation of the landscape. So you're not getting these large intact chunks anymore. You're starting to get a bunch of little pastures dotted across the landscape. So cultivation, again, is one of the main reasons, but habitat loss also occurs from the construction of residential acreages, urban encroachment in large cities, as well as energy development. And again, habitat loss is slowing kind of in the breeding range, but it's kind of just starting to pick up in the wintering areas. So in northern Mexico, there's been unprecedented cultivation in recent years. And as you can see kind of by this picture here, it's a very dry, arid, desert-like sort of grassland. So traditionally it hasn't been used for a lot of agriculture. It's been suitable for kind of low intensity grazing. But with the development of irrigation systems, you're starting to see a lot more cultivation, and then you see a lot of these green circles popping up, which are a result of those irrigation pivots and keeping agriculture afloat in these regions. So here you can kind of get an idea of where a lot of this habitat loss is occurring. So the white areas are areas that are cultivated, and the green areas are kind of remaining grasslands. And you can see that in Canada, about 27% of grasslands remain across the prairie region. Alberta tends to have the most native prairie remaining. This is around the 43% range. Saskatchewan has about 22%, and Manitoba has 18%. But this map doesn't quite represent the amount of native prairie that's available on the landscape, because through these remote sensing techniques, it's difficult to determine what's native prairie and what's seeded grassland. So in fact, there might even be less than kind of that 22% mark available to Sprague's pipits. Another factor that's weighing in on this habitat loss is just the encroachment of woody vegetation. So as humans have kind of settled in the region, there's been wide-scale efforts to suppress wildfires, and this has had a pretty large effect on just the invasion of woody vegetation into these areas. So you have your aspen parkland, which was kind of a thin layer of forest just before you get to the boreal region, but without fire, it's getting gradually larger and larger. So it's expanding southwards into the prairie and making less habitat available for these bird species. Also, without fire, you're seeing a lot more shrubs kind of expanding out of some of these riparian areas, as well as trees in some of these farmsteads. And in the map here, just kind of the green areas represent areas with trees or shrubs, and you can see kind of all throughout the prairies, there is a lot of woody vegetation growth. Rangeland degradation is another important factor. So Sprague's pipits are fairly tolerant of moderate grazing. However, once you start to get into your high intensity grazing pastures, it'll generally avoid these areas. But it also has kind of the same effect on the opposite scale too. It'll avoid areas that are overgrazed, but it'll also avoid areas that are refrained from grazing. So pastures that remain idle and no grazing occurs, it can have a similar negative effect as if you were overgrazing. And both extremes can result in increase in invasive species and woody vegetation, as well as a reduction in range condition. So kind of at both ends of the spectrum, this alters the structure of the vegetation, so it's no longer used by Sprague's pipits. So if you have situations with overgrazing, you don't get that carryover of vegetation from one year to the next. So you don't have that nice litter layer for Sprague's pipits to make their nest within. And then if you have fields that remain idle, you get too much of that litter and actually becomes too dense for Sprague's pipits to use and start constructing nests within. So there are a few other causes too. They might not be quite as important as the ones I've gone through before. Some of them aren't as well studied either, so it's unsure the effects, but some of these include haying. This might have less impact to Sprague's pipits because haying typically occurs on tame pastures, where it's been found that Sprague's pipits would prefer native grasslands opposed to these. But for those Sprague's pipits that are nesting in tame pastures, haying could influence both nest success as well as just reducing overall overhead cover. resulting in the species not using these areas. Suppression of fires, another thing, it relates very closely to that encroachment of woody vegetation. So without fire, you start to see a lot more of those shrubs and trees. But at the same time, fire also would regularly take away that, that litter layer if it's accumulating too much and kind of restart the prairie back to a point where Sprague's pipits could use it. Nest predation is becoming a big one as well. So humans have modified the landscape in a way that benefits a lot of these generalist predators such as magpies, crows, raccoons, and skunks. And these are the main predators of Sprague's pipit nests as well as young birds. Pesticides is a little less known, but because the species is an insectivore, it is possible that pesticide residues from the prey that the parents bring back to the food could end up in the chicks in some cases, depending on the pesticide type. And just overall use of insecticides reduces the amount of insects and would significantly reduce the amount of prey available to the species. And then severe climatic events, so these are prolonged periods of drought. This has negative effects on Sprague's pipit populations if they occur too long. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have extremely wet years, which also reduces nest success. And then extreme rain events will even flood out nests in some cases too, having negative impacts. So the last reason kind of for the listing is the fact that Sprague's pipit is a habitat specialist. So again, they use these large parcels of native prairie. They prefer areas with intermediate grass height as well as vegetation density. So they're typically found in that 10 to 30 centimeter tall grass range. They also prefer areas with moderate amounts of litter, and very few shrubs, and flat to gently rolling topography. So you won't see them in a lot of these areas with very steep hills or kind of coulee areas. They like that flatter terrain. Sprague's pipits are rarely found in cultivated fields and are much less abundant in tame pastures than they are in native prairie. They will use seeded grasslands in some situations, but this is only if kind of the structure of that grass mimics what you would see in a prairie situation. And it could also have things to do with the overall landscape as well. So if you have a tame pasture that's surrounded by a lot of native pasture, it's more likely a Sprague's pipit would use that than a tame pasture just surrounded by cultivated land. Sprague's pipit is believed to be area sensitive, so this means that densities of the birds as well as number of young rays tend to increase as the grassland size increases as well. So kind of the graphs at the bottom here represent, to the right here, that's your probability of seeing a pipit in a certain grassland. You can see that it goes up quite a bit as you get into larger grassland patch sizes. The same is also true kind of for the number of indicated pairs that you'd see per hectare, although this relationship isn't as strong as the other one. And Sprague's pipits have also been found to be positive related to range condition. So as range condition improves, you also tend to see an increase in the number of singing males on a pasture. And this has to do with a lot of the pastures that are in poor range condition also tend to be heavily grazed as well. So kind of the main emphasis on Sprague's pipit conservation and starting to at least stabilize the population, hopefully one day return it kind of to more natural levels that it was maybe towards the mid-60s. And that is to maintain and improve existing grassland habitat on both the breeding and wintering grounds. So it's well known that native grassland is limited in many of these regions. However, it is likely that there is still sufficient amounts of suitable grassland still available on the habitat or on the landscape that would at least be able to support pipits at their current level. So it's not about, at this point, not about trying to restore a lot of these grasslands. It's very difficult to do. It's just making sure no more grasslands lost so that declines continue to kind of spiral out of control. So a lot of emphasis right now is maintaining these grasslands and also trying to rehabilitate some of the existing grasslands that were maybe overgrazed in the past. To do this also, a lot of emphasis has been placed on preserving grasslands in landscapes where a lot of native prairie already exists, rather than trying to restore patches in cultivated dominated lands, because it's less likely a Sprague's pipit would use these areas. And then another thing is just trying to implement some different management strategies on these grasslands that would be able to promote Sprague's pipits. And then a big thing is just trying to find common ground with the ranching industry. So, in fact, if it weren't for livestock production and ranching, it's very likely that you'd see a lot of these endemic bird species, because very few, a very low proportion of the native prairie is actually protected. A lot of this is tied up with cattle production. And in truth, many of the range management practices that are used by the cattle industry are very compatible with Sprague's pipit breeding habitat. So these are range practices that maintain moderate amounts of residual cover and a patchy distribution. Also practices that do not result in large increases in bare ground, shrubs, non-native plants, or practices that cause rangelands to degrade into a poor range condition. So as you can see by kind of all of these points here, they're all things that range managers are usually trying to achieve on their lands as well. And there's nothing on this list that would have very significant negative impacts to the rancher at the same time. So it's just a matter of forming these partnerships with the two and trying to get them to reach a common goal. So I'm just going to finish off here with just a few of my research objectives that I'm doing with my master's degree right now, and how this kind of ties into Sprague's pipit conservation. So the main objective of my research is to identify preferred ranges for some of these grassland characteristics. So it is trying to identify what characteristics of a grassland are likely to explain why you would see a pipit in one area as opposed to another one. So if I take that grass height example, it's been found that they like the 10 to 30 centimeter of range for grass height. But I also want to try and identify some of these other characteristics and find similar ranges that you can actually put a value to. So in the process of doing this by conducting a series of grassland bird surveys, so I'll go out to a lot of these native rangelands and conduct breeding bird surveys. So by standing in a single point, I'll stand there for 5 minutes, and during that period I'll record all the Sprague's pipits or any other grassland birds that I see for that 5-minute time period. And this is done within a 100-meter radius of where I'm standing. And at the end, you kind of get a tally of the number of Sprague's pipits as well as any other bird types that are found kind of in that hypothetical circle. And these surveys are conducted during the breeding period. So this is from May to mid-July. And they're also restricted to the morning, so from sunrise to about 9 a.m. And this is the period of time when male songbirds are actively defending their territories. They're a lot easier to detect at this point because they're very vocal. And singing rates tend to decrease as you move throughout the day. So kind of very early in the morning is the best time to go look for these birds. Once the bird surveys are conducted, the next step is to quantify the habitat that's available at that survey location. So I have a series of characteristics that I've identified that are either important to grassland birds or they're important to land managers kind of from a range health perspective that I'm looking at just to see which one of these are strong predictors of grassland abundance and which could be used as management targets for the species. So I'll just go over kind of some of the things that I'm looking at. So the first one is percent cover. So this is taken by looking at a square or rectangular sample frame and just estimating the proportion of each vegetation types that's found within. So proportion of native grasses to exotic grasses as well as shrubs, forbs, and other cover types such as bare ground and dead plant material. I also look at vegetation density. So this is the density of grass found in an area and its ability to conceal nests for the species. So this is done using a standardized method with a Robel pole, and that's just a simple pole with black and white increments painted on it. So these are usually done every centimeter. And you stick the pole on the ground, and then 4 meters away you measure what's the lowest mark on that pole you can see, and that gives you your index of vegetation density. Shrub density is also another big one that I'm looking at. So within these survey locations, I'm setting up 30-meter transects that are walked, and as I move along them, I record the number of shrubs that I see just to give you an idea of the number of shrubs per unit area. While I'm doing shrub density measurements, I'm also doing cow pie measurements. So for some of these species that live in these very overgrazed habitats, there's not a lot of cover, and they'll actually use cow pies as a source of concealment for the nest. This isn't the case for Sprague's pipits because they like that moderate vegetation height. But the thing that cow pies might reflect in terms of Sprague's pipits is the grazing intensity of that area. So as you would expect, if the area was more intensively grazed the previous year, you would expect to see more cow pies in that region. And it's this grazing intensity that's probably more important to Sprague's pipits. Vegetation height and litter depth is another thing I'm looking at. So again, litter is just that layer of dead, unattached plant material that's occurring at the soil surface, and it's used for nesting. And along with that, I also look at litter mass. So this is done using a 25 by 25 centimeter square. I collect all the litter within that area, and then you can compare it back to this chart. And this gives you a rough estimate of the amount of pounds per acre of litter that occurs in that grassland. And this is a standard process that's used to measure rangeland health. These samples I'm also taking back and drying them and weighing them more accurately, just to see how well this chart represents actual conditions. And then by getting those more accurate measurements, I'm just trying to see if I can tease out any trends that are at a more fine scale than what could be shown by this chart. Another objective of my research is to compare the habitat preferences of Sprague's pipits throughout their range. So for this part of my project, the reason I've chosen southwestern Saskatchewan is not only there's a lot of native rangelands that still exist in there, but there's also a fairly well-defined moisture gradient that exists as well. So as you move from the US border north towards the Aspen Parkland and Boreal region, you generally see an increase in the amount of precipitation, and this has a direct influence on the type of habitat that's available. So as you're seeing this increase in precipitation, you're also seeing increases in both vegetation height and density, as well as the amount of shrubs and other woody vegetation. So by putting survey points at different regions along this gradient, I can determine whether Sprague's pipits are selecting the same type of grasslands at the southern portion of the range and comparing this to what they're selecting for the northern part of the range, just to see if they're indeed actually selecting for the same things, or do they choose totally new grassland sites as new habitat becomes available. And this is important from a management perspective, because if you're trying to manage for Sprague's pipits on a specific grassland, you want to know whether management targets can be applied to the entire region, or you need to kind of break it into smaller subregions. Thirdly, I'm also trying to compare habitat preferences between species. So if a lot of management is going on to improve Sprague's pipit numbers, I think it's very important to figure out what effect this is going to have on a lot of the other bird species in that area. So you might be managing for Sprague's pipits and trying to get that medium density type of grass, but this could in fact be having negative influences on your species like bobolink, that taller, thicker grass. And it almost surely would have negative influences on other species like McCown's longspur, like that very heavily grazed areas. So this is just an example of the species that I'm looking at. So there are 4 other songbird species at risk that I'm comparing Sprague's pipits to. These are the bobolink, which is just right here, the chestnut-colored longspur, as well as the McCown's longspur and the Barred sparrow. And then kind of all around those ones, there's a wide variety of other songbird species that also co-occur in these grasslands. And although they're not listed as at risk, I mentioned earlier, a lot of these species are kind of showing declining population trends. So it's important to also factor these in, because it's unsure whether or which ones of these species could end up on these endangered and threatened species list in the near future. And then a big portion of my research is also going into comparing Sprague's pipit and these other songbird habitat preferences to greater sage grouse. So because greater sage grouse exists at such low population numbers in southwestern Saskatchewan, there's a lot of work and management that's going on to try and improve the habitat for these birds. And there's very little research on that has been done to see what effect this might have on some of the other species at risk in the area. So it's important just to kind of see how this will affect Sprague's pipits. Will they actually benefit from this, which would be the ideal situation where you can kind of work a bunch of conservation strategies into one single one, or maybe they have very different habitat preferences and you kind of have to manage for them separately and probably in different areas than where safe ghost management is occurring. And kind of the ultimate goal of my work is to take everything that I've learned from this project and develop a series of management targets for all these specific habitat characteristics. So you can set targets for different traits of grassland, such as grass height or density, and implement them on the ground. And by achieving these targets, you're hopefully promoting those species in these areas. It's important to use habitat measurements that are not only important to the birds, but are also familiar to landowners and range managers, because those are the folks that will be actually implementing these on these targets on their properties. The work could also be applied to best management practices on protected lands, as well as federal and community lands, such as federal and provincial lands, such as community pastures. In this case, you could set targets that not only allow livestock production to continue to occur, but also take into account some of these endangered wildlife species as well. They could also be applied to species recovery strategies, because a lot is still unknown about the habitat preferences of Sprague's pipits and some of these other species. And it also takes into account how habitat preferences may change throughout their range. And lastly, it could be applied to a results-based conservation program. So these are programs that are becoming more and more popular around the world, and also right here in southwestern Saskatchewan, there's kind of a big initiative to start these up. But these are programs where that take into account if a rancher or a property owner is trying to implement some of these strategies to improve grassland bird habitat, they're also receiving some economic loss at the same time. So whether this is just increased activity on their lands, or increased monitoring, or cutting back the number of cattle that they can have, these all have negative economic effects. And this results-based conservation program would kind of give them incentives to offset some of these costs. So the number of management targets they achieve on their properties would kind of determine kind of how much payment they receive coming back. So that concludes my presentation here. I'd just like to thank just a few of my funding sources, as well as partners with the project, as well as my supervisors, Dr. Mark Brigham at the University of Regina and Dr. Stephen Davis at Environment Canada. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to give it a shot and try to answer them for you. Anything to do with the presentation or grassland birds in general.
Thank you.
Are you looking for nesting places?
No, so this is just on territory establishment. It's not at the nesting scale. That's something you definitely want to consider moving forward, is they might be using these areas, but what do you see in terms of nest success? But this is kind of very low intensity. It's just going out to these grasslands and trying to identify what birds are there and how many of them are occurring.
Can you go back with some of the pictures of their birds, and then we can...
Yep. Do you want me to go right to the very start where there's...
No.
Is that one good? Or?
Yeah, that one's good.
Yep.
The one on the bottom left corner there, what is that?
Bottom left. So down here?
Yeah.
That's a horned lark.
Or-
Yeah. Yeah, the pictures are a little grainy, so it is a little difficult, but yeah.
And the one halfway on the right?
This one right here?
Yeah.
So that's a McCown's longspur. McCown's longspur. And they're not too common in Saskatchewan. They're more kind of around the Grasslands National Park area. They like that really short vegetation that you see kind of in the drier grasslands. So it's a special concern right now, but I think it's being upgraded to either threatened or endangered at this point. But it's mostly because it's at the very northern extent of its range, and there's just very few of them existing in Canada.
And you said all of those are endangered?
No, only 4 of the species are actually listed as species at risk. The other ones are just common grassland birds that occur in the same,
Oh,
well, I wouldn't
okay.
say common, but grassland birds you'd see in the area.
Yeah.
But only 4 of them right now are at risk. But it is possible that when they review the species again, just because a lot of them are declining, that there may be a few more that are at risk. And then sage grouse, definitely, it's an endangered species as well.
Well, you used to see lots and lots of lark buntings, and you seldom see them anymore. Occasionally you'll see one, but.
Yeah, and actually, lark buntings are kind of interesting too, because you get really high numbers of them some years, and then really low numbers other years, and you don't. There's not really an explanation why that occurs, but this year actually turned out to be a really good year for lark buntings. I know we saw quite a bit, but that's pretty atypical of a lot of years. And I know I think it's one of the birds that's actually being considered to be added as one of the species at risk.
Too bad.
What's the bird in the center there? Grouse?
This one right here, yeah, that's the greater sage-grouse there. And my project focuses mostly on the songbird species, but with all the management that's going on to try and improve greater sage-grouse habitat, it just seemed like an interesting species to also kind of to look at and see what the effects are. Because they're typical of more sagebrush habitats, but they will use some of these more open prairie areas for certain parts of their life cycle. So maybe not all greater sage-grouse habitat would benefit species like the Sprague's pipit, but there might be some overlap in some of these areas. So that'll be an interesting thing to find out. Yeah.
What's the #1 thing you think everyone can do to help grassland songbirds?
#1 thing that everybody can do,
Yeah.
encourage or discourage the cultivation of native prairie. So I think it's very important that the amount of native prairie that still exists, although it's not very much, just kind of speak out and make it so it's not so easy for people to just go and plow it out. Because once it's lost, it's lost. And I think just the amount of native prairie is one of the biggest things why populations are so low for these species. And I guess if there's any way to support ranchers or locally grown beef that do it in an environmentally friendly way too, that's another thing too. Any other questions?